Um, but that's not all we have for you today. Next up, we are going to hear from Aliana Clark and the Infodemiology modules team. So I will pass it over to you, Aliana.
Hello, thank you for having us, Arlo. I'm here with Betsy Pleasance, as well as a couple of the students that worked on their projects. Oh, and Barbara's here as well. Hi, Barbara. Dara and Georgie. So I'm just going to give a little bit overview of what the class was, and then they will kind of tell you about what their specific projects were. So Infodemiology is a one-year research project through data science modules and the School of Public Health collaboration. So they started last August, September, and they look at Google Trends data and have team members from both the data science department as well as the School of Public Health and faculty members from the School of Public Health to study different Google Trends as it relates to mental health, pregnancy, and nutrition. And Barbara is the faculty member on the nutrition team. And they did an awesome job. They have a couple of presentations for you. I'll let Dara take it away. But it was really exciting and really amazing to see how far all of these teams came. There was 12 total students. So here you go, Dara, take it away.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Dara. So I was part of the pregnancy team for the Infodemiology project, and I'll share my slide. So as a part of the pregnancy project, my teammates and I were all listed here, examined Google user search concerns regarding coronavirus in babies. And so here's some just background about coronavirus pandemic and how babies or the effect of the coronavirus on babies and on children was of concern. And so thinking about like how that was occurring and how like the disease processes might have been different or affected children differently, we decided to explore what Google user search concerns regarding COVID and babies were. And so here are some of the research questions that we explored. And then we looked in this time period from February 2020 to 2021. And we really wanted to examine how the search, like the interest over time for that search term COVID in babies differed in the United States versus Texas, considering all of the different levels of politicization that was happening regarding the coronavirus and the differences in information that was available to citizens in like the United States as a whole versus just in Texas. And so here are just like our methods. We use the Google Health Trends API and the custom search API, and then we also used the Google Trends website. And so this is once again our initial search question. So the first thing we did was look at this initial search term COVID in babies, and then we found all of these follow-ups. And then the term that was most concern was this that was in red, babies with COVID in Texas and 85 babies with COVID. And so because this came up in our first initial exploration, we decided to explore Texas more deeply because this was coming up nationally. And this is also our API findings. But before like looking at Texas, we wanted to look at what the general interest over time for COVID in babies was in 3 different regions, California, US, and Texas. And we found that Texas had a very high interest over time as compared to another big state like California, and also compared to the US as a whole. And so that got us thinking, like with that follow-up search term of 85 babies in COVID, as well as Texas having or sorry, 85 babies with COVID in Texas, and also Texas having like a higher search interest over time. We wanted to explore what was happening in Texas that was so different, that was causing people to search more about COVID in babies versus like the United States. And so then we looked at the United States as a whole to like set a baseline, and we found most prominently that the Google Trends like interest over time for the United States kind of followed the hospitalization rates for children and babies across the US as well. And so we thought that those two things might be related. As hospitalizations increased, the search interest for COVID in babies on Google also increased. And we also found that there was some relationship possibly between federal government responses and also the search peaks of this Google Trends interest over time for our time period. And so in terms of, so the US in general had a very disjointed federal response to the coronavirus, but for the most prominent responses that the government did have, we found that there was also a spike in interest over time for the search term COVID in babies. And so we thought that those two might be related. And then we looked more deeply into Texas after setting like the US as a baseline. And we found that Google search users in Texas were having a more narrow search for COVID and babies. They were really just looking at general COVID symptoms for kids and babies, and were more concerned about children and babies in general as compared to COVID symptoms for everybody. And so here's the Google Trends interest over time for that search term, COVID and babies. And most prominently, we found that the hospitalization rate in general in Texas also corresponded or could possibly correspond with the interest over time for COVID in babies for Texas. So we thought that maybe those two things could be related. As hospitalizations increased in Texas, more folks were searching for COVID in babies on Google as well. But as we were looking for more data regarding children, we found that there was a huge issue, and we couldn't actually find any information regarding hospitalizations for children and babies. And there was a huge gap in our data, so we couldn't really like make that comparison. And we found that it was because there was a new Trump policy in 2020, which happened in July, which is kind of around when this peak in Google search interest over time occurs. That hospitals in Texas and in the US in general were no longer obligated to share data with the CDC. And so this like deeply fragmented the information that we we had available. And so looking more deeply at this, we saw that like due to the incomplete data, the data suppression um, around what was happening in Texas, which also was exacerbated by the years of underfunding in public health in Texas, was reflected in like the really high interest over time that Google users in Texas had, especially compared to the United States. And so we tried to explore a little more about like what could be happening in Texas that's causing the higher interest over time. And we also, from the public health side, we were able to make that comparison between the US and Texas as a whole. And we saw that Texas, going back to like underfunding of public health, um, a lot of Texans are also uninsured, and had Texas in general had the lowest public health emergency preparedness funding, which could also exacerbate, um, could also, excuse me, drive Texans to turn to Google to search for like public health data or information about healthcare, information about like coronavirus and babies and symptoms, because a lot of folks don't have access to healthcare, um, especially compared to the rest of the US. And here are just some more details about what could have been related to the like peaks in the interest over time in Texas. That we also found that those peaks corresponded with Governor Abbott's opening and closing decisions. So usually when he opened and then opened up all the businesses in Texas or made like that declaration and also decided to close, that kind of corresponded with like spikes in the interest over time for the search term COVID in babies. And traveling during the holidays also corresponded with that. And so then we looked a little deeper to compare the US and Texas um, a little closer. And we found that for the terms that US and Texas have in common, that Texas had a higher RSV on average. And thinking about that, we also went back to our Google Trends graph and we saw that the interest over time in Texas was also higher in the higher on average than the interest over time was for the US for that search term COVID in babies. And just to like consolidate all of our information, after really confirming that the average interest over time in the RSV was higher for Texas, and thinking about the differences in Texas compared to the United States, we saw that the higher interest, higher RSV might be related to the underreporting of data and the data suppression about hospitalizations in children, which could have caused folks to turn to Google and as well as like the other issues with the hospitalization and case rates increasing. So that was pretty much the extent of what our findings were surrounding coronavirus in babies and Google search user concerns.
Thank you, Zara. It was really exciting to see too the way that you brought in really important public health topics and policy as well. Next, we have Georgie, who's going to talk about mental health resources during COVID. And then we can ask all the questions at the end. Does that sound good? All right, awesome. Go ahead, Georgie.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So I'm representing my mental health team, which is a team within the Infodemiology. And our title of our research is Insights from Google Data on Seeking Mental Health Resources Online During COVID. And my team was Robin G, Adrian Kwok, Oscar Ramos, myself, and we were kind of supervised by Juliana Deerdorf. Okay. So a little background from our project. With shelter-in-place restrictions initiated globally, social and physical isolation, disrupted work and education, and concerns over health are just several stressors that have been tied with the pandemic. Surveys of adults in the US show that prevalence of depression symptoms was more than 3 times higher during the COVID pandemic than before. And additionally, elevated levels of loneliness have been significantly associated with greater depression and suicidal ideation since shelter-in-place policies were enacted. So in combination with shelter-in-place ordinances, these findings led us to want to investigate how mental health resources were utilized and the manner in which they were searched for during the pandemic. So our research, we had 4 research questions. Our first one being, did online searches for mental health terms increase in the United States following COVID-19 shelter-in-place restrictions from March 2020? Number 2 being, given COVID-19 restrictions put in place in 2020, did search behavior for therapy terms change from 2019 to 2020? Number 3, how is change in search behavior for therapy from 2019 to 2020 different between states with varying levels of COVID restrictions? And we specifically chose California and Florida, and I'll explain why in the next slide. And our last question being, what web pages are currently being most commonly presented to searchers in the US for mental health and therapy services? Sorry. Just a broad overview of our methods. We use RSVs and RSI generated from the Health Trends and Trends API, the Google Trends API, to create visualizations on Tableau and Jupyter Hub for all three of our search terms. And these search terms were mental health resources, therapy, and therapy near me. And similar to the pregnancy group, we also used Wallet Hub data. And this helped us choose our most strict and least strict COVID-19 shelter-in-place restrictions. So Wallet Hub had like a ranking for how strict their COVID restrictions were, shelter-in-place restrictions, created visualizations in Tableau using the custom search API data, which is how we gathered the information from the web pages. Sorry, I'm getting a little twisted with my words. So a few of the visualizations that my team created, Robin created RSV pie charts using the Google Trends API, and her specific time period was January to October of 2019, and she compared that to January to October of 2020. And then I created some RSI directed graphs. And we just like cleaned the data, filtered out like redundant or unrelated terms. And in terms of web page data, we use the custom search API specifically only for the United States. And this time period being from January 2020 to April 2021. And these are Robin's visualizations.
For a little background too, sorry, Georgie.
Okay.
For RSV, it stands for relative search volume. So it's how you compare the follow-up terms. And so the visualization that Georgie is going to be showing and the ones following too all compare the terms that come up when one initial search term is looked at through the API, just for some background. Thank you, Georgie.
Yeah, thank you, Aliana. Okay, so since RSV, the relative search volume of our top queries sum up to approximately 1, Robin created these pie charts, and each wedge represents the RSV value for a specific top query. And so as we can see, first there are the pie charts for the US in general and show how user concern has changed from 2019 to 2020. And where mental health related top queries pretty much doubled relative to concern for non-mental health related top queries between both years. And here are the pie charts for California and Florida. Florida is at the top and California is at the bottom. So the blue indicates non-mental health related top queries that popped up when looking at the term therapy, our initial search term therapy, and the red/orange hues are mental health related terms. So here we can see that Florida from 2019 to 2020, the proportion of RSV values of mental health related top queries to non-mental health related top queries stayed approximately the same, whereas in California, the proportion of RSV values of mental health related top queries saw an increase from 2019 to 2020 relative to RSV values for non-mental health related top queries. And from these results, we kind of drew these important conclusions about how strictness of COVID-19 has some sort of relationship to changes in Google user concern for mental health resources. And the following visualizations are just like kind of extra visualizations that I created on Tableau. So this just kind of gives like a good proportional I don't know how to describe it. So I like here we have free mental health resources, which is a top query when people search mental health resources in the search bar of Google. And so it looks like the biggest chunk is free mental health resources, followed by Black mental health resources. And I would have liked to like dive into this more, but moving on, here's another one for RSV and their associated top queries for the term therapy. So here's the list of the follow-up terms that pop up. So within this list, we could see art therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, couples therapy, etc. Online therapy right here. And the last RSV and top query visualization for therapy near me. So the biggest chunk of it falls in therapist near me. And so moving on to the custom search API, where we looked at web page information and site probability, stuff like that. Here's another like bubble graph that I created that just has the website and its associated site probability. And these are the top 10 websites that fall under mental health resources. And each one has like a position ranked 1 through 10, and the position is indicated by the darkness of or lightness of the circles, and the size is indicated by site probability. And here's the same thing for therapy. So a few of these websites in these visualizations are actually like non-mental health related. One of them being like apartment therapy, which is like some interior design website. And obviously that's not helpful for people that are actually seeking therapy during a pandemic. And we also like created this simple data frame that's not included in this slideshow, but it is included in our info sheet that will be at the Wallace Center, hopefully. But sorry, to move on, a summary of our findings from 2019 to 2020, the RSVs for mental health related top queries for the term therapy doubled relative to non-mental health related top queries, indicating increased searches and user concern for mental health focused services during the pandemic. This trend is more pronounced in a state with more COVID restrictions, ours being California, than a state with fewer COVID restrictions, being Florida. And yeah, some of our strengths are that we had objective data, we had access to these Google APIs outside of like the public trends website, and comparison of time and location. So specifically a parallel comparison of California and Florida. And then a few limitations that we have are that we have no demographic info, so we're unable to identify specific groups, and we have sparse data. We couldn't gather data on all individual states because the API wouldn't output anything when we got to a state with like a smaller population, and only current top web pages. So we're unable to retroactively identify top web pages, and it's an ever-changing pandemic, so restrictions and regulations were constantly changing throughout. This is just a slide of our future directions. So ultimately, learning how mental health resources are searched for and sought after online can help direct more effective dissemination of resources and information broadly to the general public and targeted among vulnerable population. So these being, we need to prioritize mental health during and after the pandemic, and there needs to be additional research and data to build upon findings, as well as need for improving government coordination and pandemic response. And that's the end of my presentation.